Tonight's topic is detransition, retransition, interrupted or discontinued transition, and our speakers will be Ron and Chris. And I am going to, looking at the time, I'm going to hand over to Ron to get us going.
Thank you so much, Alana. So welcome, everyone. We are in preparing for this evening. The topic of, I'm going to just use the one concept, the topic of detransitioning and people who detransition continues to be and has for some time significantly been one of the controversial topics in the field of transgender and gender diverse persons, in particular in the field of gender affirming healthcare, with two particular tensions, often highlighted when it comes to this topic, where we have this tension on the one end with regards to, for example, transgender activists, often finding themselves in a kind of a hostile position in relation to people who detransition. And we have this unfortunate history on that side of the spectrum where persons who are altering or changing their navigation with regards to their gender journey, but in particular, the persons that have been given the label, and which hopefully will kind of come to understanding as we navigate through this evening, the term detransition often being inappropriately or incorrectly utilized for a significant proportion of persons. But yeah, we've had this tension where with trans activists having a particular tension with people who identify as detransitioners. And if we look at the literature, we will find, as I mentioned, there's this almost this like hostile position towards persons who identify as detransitioners, where they're often dismissed, or even language that kind of alludes to things like being a defector or a traitor. So very, very problematic tension on that end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum, where we have the more conservative, transphobic contingents that we find unfortunately in our societies, that have essentially kind of taken the detransition theme and used it as a whipping stick, used it as a boogeyman, and in particular using it as a way to attack the validity of gender affirming healthcare. And then in between those two extreme tensions, there has been a lot of further kind of development and thinking and understanding of the fact that, what hopefully will, where Chris and I will go is highlighting what we know today to be the fluidity of the journey for many when it comes to their becoming of self in regards to their gender identity. So we did decide this is a topic that we need to address, and it's a topic that we need to include within our discourses and within our conversations, as uncomfortable as it sometimes can be. So how we have decided to approach this is I'm going to firstly play a presentation, or actually a study that was presented by a colleague of mine, Dr. Alexandre Baril, who is a professor in social work at the School of Social Work at the University of Ottawa, who actually at the previous WAS conference presented some of their findings of a study they were doing, particularly with regards to persons who detransition. And I then have been in communication with him, and he's given me permission that we can actually play that presentation of his that was presented at the WAS conference. So I'm going to firstly be playing Alexandre's presentation. It's a 15-minute presentation. Then I'm going to play us 2 short TikToks that essentially attempts to summarize very quickly some of the statistics that is known. So there is more and more research happening around understanding detransition, understanding regret, so-called regret. I'm going to play 2 TikToks that will present that. And while those are playing in the chat, just that you do know, I have done my due diligence, and I have verified that all of the research that is referenced actually is true and real research. So while we are listening to these, the presentation and the TikToks, I will in the chat I'll be placing information about our the first presenter, as well as information about the various studies that are going to be referenced. I'm not going to address that, but it's there available for you to copy and keep. After we've played the presentation and the 2 TikToks, I will do some reflections, and then Chris will do some reflections. We'll engage in a bit of a conversation, but then we're going to open it up to the audience for us to have a conversation on the topic of detransitioning, retransitioning, the fact that people may alter the trajectory of their transition journeys as they move through the process. So we don't have a fixed, absolute, kind of set of content. We are hoping that what we're going to listen to now will, get us thinking and, to get the conversation going, because there's no way we can address this fairly complex topic in one evening. So now will everyone please take a kind of hold their breath with me and hope that I now get the technology to actually work with me. So I'm going to start the talk by Alexandre, and while you're listening, I'll put the information about the speaker in the chat. All right, so work with me, pray with me.
Hello, everyone. When McLachlan, principal investigator of the Detrans research project, approached me to join the research team, I was very interested to join the team due to my long-term interest in the questions of detransition. I, together with Marjorie Silverman, have worked on the question of detransition in a study on trans older adults living with dementia. We wrote about the type of interventions that should be put forward in case some of them forget the transition or re-identify with their sex assigned at birth. I was excited by the idea of delving into the topic of detransition from the other end of the age spectrum. Based on my observations at that time, I noticed that the discourses on detransition in the case of both young people and older adults seem to emerge from clinical perspectives and be crystallized around the idea that if detransitions occur, it is because transitions should not have occurred in the first place. According to this logic, the transitions were mistakes. These hasty conclusions were soon picked up by the media to fuel anti-trans sentiments and worries about trans-affirmative healthcare. I also noticed that the trans community's activists and researchers were quick to dismiss the reality of detransition itself and to deconstruct those empirical studies on surgical regrets and desistance, and on the now infamous rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROD, popularized by Littman. I myself participated, for example, with Florence Ashley, in this wave of scholarship that showed that studies on ROD, desistance, and detransitions are flawed on so many levels and constitute bad science. These studies not only have important methodological limitations, but they also raise ethical and political issues in relation to what is done or not done to trans and non-binary people. There is, however, one thing that struck me as a similar between the discourses on detransition on both older adults and youth and the reactions to them. This similarity is that the attitude of the trans communities, activists, and scholars that endorse trans affirmative perspective is a no-go, a denial of the possibility of detransition. For example, in our research on the various interventions potentially offered to trans older adults living with dementia who detransition or re-identified with their sex assigned at birth, Marjorie Silverman and I identified 3 potential strategies. The first, a gender neutralization approach that consists essentially of avoiding gender altogether. A second, a trans affirmative stable approach that insists on the trans chosen identity and negates the possibility of a detransition. And the third one, a trans affirmative fluid approach that recognizes the possibility of a detransition and privileges supporting the person in the here and now. We showed that most scholarship from a trans-positive perspective, as well as trans community organizations and activists, endorse the second approach. Detransition, in that case, is explained mostly through 2 factors. Either the person is cognitively impaired by dementia and is confused, an interpretation we characterize as ableist insaneness, or the person is seen as pressured by external factors to detransitions, such as cisgenderist society or family. There is likewise a growing literature on youth from a trans-affirmative approach that insists on the fact that regrets following trans-affirmative healthcare are extremely rare, and that most desisters or detransitioners have probably been unduly influenced by external pressures to detransition. In sum, detransition appears as a repudiated subject among a majority of trans-affirmative proponents. Looking at the reactions to the discourses on detransition, I think that the denial of the existence of detransition altogether, or the quick dismissal of its significance through the usage of low statistics of regrets, or the explanations of detransition solely on the basis of external cisgenderist pressures, ignore the complexity of the issues at stake and therefore do not serve our communities and scholarship. I would even say that through a performative mechanism, we produce the entity we try to reject. Indeed, by trying to combat cisgenderist conclusions in the studies on desistance and detransition, and by painting detransition as the antithesis of transition, we contribute to creating a monolithic perception of detransition as something bad that casts a shadow on trans communities and the care they can or cannot access. In other words, fighting against cisgenderist discourses on detransition paradoxically creates and reinforces one homogeneous view of that phenomenon that erases its complexity. Going back to our research project, it was clear based on those observations that we needed to complexify the discourses on detransitions through empirical data with people who detransitions themselves. The interviews with those youth would allow us to get a better picture of their lived experience and start shifting the power imbalance when it comes to who says what on detransition. We thought it was important that discourses on detransition don't emerge only from research teams that are conservative, anti-trans, and cautious about trans-affirmative approach, but also from research teams that are embracing a trans-affirmative fluid approach. There is indeed a huge gap to fill in order to start understanding, supporting, and providing care for people who detransition from a trans-positive perspective. Furthermore, as attested in several articles on the Detrans phenomenon, there is much confusion surrounding terms such as detransition, desistance, retransition, and so forth. For example, Exposito's Campos proposes the following distinction, quote, The typology proposed in this article distinguishes between two main types of detransition, core or primary, and non-core or secondary detransitions. In core detransitions, the decision is primarily motivated by the cessation of that transgender identity. In non-core detransitions, the decision is influenced by reasons other than the cessation of a transgender identity. This category potentially includes anyone who stops or reverses their gender transition, but continues to identify as transgender. Some authors, such as Eli Vendebush, who identifies herself as a female detransitioner, endorse that distinctions between self-identification versus the process of detransition itself. In a similar way, Hildebrand Troop distinguishes between people who endorse the detransitioner identification and those who don't but still have detransition, quote. To refer to the broader category of individuals who are or have been in the process of detransition, whether they adopt a detransitioner identity or not, I use the admittedly awkward phrase, people who have detransitioned. And the author talked about all the reasons why a person could detransition. So to avoid this awkward expression, I would propose that in order to distinguish between the two types, we describe the second type as people who discontinued their transition. While not all detransitioners endorse cisgenderist discourses, I contend, following those authors, that their reality is quite different than the reality of people who discontinued their transition, but sometimes still identify as trans, non-binary, agender, genderless, gender indifferent, but who discontinued their transition for a wide variety of reasons. On the one hand, while the detransitioners could potentially maintain more contentious relationships with trans communities, since there is a clear break with the trans identity, those who discontinued their transition are more likely to remain connected in some way with trans communities. In fact, preliminary results from our research conducted with youth show that for many of them, while there could be some negative feelings related to the transition, their transition and detransition journey as a whole also had positive effects within their lives and in their exploration of their gender identity. On the other hand, distinguishing the two types avoids lumping together a very diverse group of people. Since many people who detransition don't identify as detransitioners, and since the people I would describe as having discontinued their transition often maintain some links with LGBTQ communities, identities, and politics, it would seem important to start reflecting on the reality of these individuals and to work to create safer spaces in our communities to welcome their experiences. While this conceptual distinction between detransitioners and people who discontinued their transition might be relevant for studying the phenomenon, it is important to remember that the line between the two should not be seen as rigid, of course. I would like to conclude by discussing the notions of cisnormativity and compulsory biographical continuity. In 2009, I coined the term cisgender normativity and cisnormativity to refer to the normative component of the cisgenderist system. Due to Anglo-normativity and other factors and the lack of visibility of notions, concepts, and ideas in languages other than English, the definition proposed the same year by Bauer and collaborator, according to which cisnormativity is, quote, the expectation that all people are cissexual, which corresponds to Julia Serrano's definition of cissexual assumption, got popularized. And we can see it's the same thing for other notions such as transnormativity. So I proposed at that time conceptual nuances to offer a broader definition of cisnormativity to refer to the norm according to which it is better to not change your identity or body than to transform them. I also mobilized the notions of cisnormativity with an asterisk to refer to the normative system that broadly normalizes identities that remain unchanged. In a recent article with Marjorie Silverman, we reused this notion of cisnormativity in a broader sense to refer to, quote, the idea that people should not change in radical ways, but rather follow prescriptive societal norms and expectations in relation to the continuity of the self. We argued that cisnormative expectations fuels what we call compulsory biographical continuity. That is the idea that someone should maintain continuity in their personhood, in their self, in terms of abilities, cognition, gender, and so forth. Any interruptions, disruptions, transformation, or transition is seen as impacting this moral injunction to remain relatively the same person across lifespan. From that perspective, it becomes possible to see how both transitions and detransitions transgress the compulsory biographical continuity and cisnormative injunctions, even though, paradoxically, someone who would retransition would go back to what the cisgender normative system was hoping for them in the first place. That reconceptualization of cisnormativity raises many questions. And one of them is it simply transition toward trans identity that elicits negative reactions, or is it more generally, regardless the direction it points toward, that creates discomfort and elicit reactions? In conclusion, I contend that it would be productive to start reflecting on the complex interlocking effects of cisgenderism and cisism, that is, quote, the oppressive system that discriminates against people on the basis of change, in order to better understand the difficult lived experience of trans, non-binary, and agender people, as well as people who discontinue their transition, who detransition, or retransitioned. We don't need to see detransitions and transition discontinuations as menaces to trans issues, but it could be productive to embrace them as another layers in the rich galaxies of gender identities we are fighting for. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that's a lot of concentrated information in a short space of time. And I just realized that when I started playing, I was unable to share the information in the chat. So while I just give you guys just a moment or two just to reflect on what you were listening to, I'm just going to quickly place in the chat. So I'm first sharing with you the biography of Alexandre, that you have his information. Then I'm going to now share with you the citation as well as the link to this presentation if you would like to revisit it. I know it's a lot of concentrated information, as I've said, in a short space of time. If you would like to go and listen to the presentation again. So there is also the link to this presentation. I'm now going to quickly play two TikTok clips, because I was saying to Alma earlier, we need to get woke and we need to get with it. And there are some excellent, content creators that are kind of trying to kind of share information for, to the wider community around, a range of issues. And I found two TikToks that specifically addresses the question around detransition and regret, and puts really important summative information in a quick digestible format. And then I am going to, after we've listened to it and I've done my reflection, I will be placing in the chat all of the sources that are referred to by these two TikTokers, though we do see that there are actually legitimate publications and legitimate research that is being referenced. Okay, so now bear with me, guys, because my technological skills are limited. Okay, so I should now be able to do the next part.
Let's talk about detransitioners. This 2015 survey is one of the biggest studies done ever on transgender people. They interviewed over 27,000 transgender people for this. What they found was that only 8% of all those people detransitioned. And of that 8% who detransitioned, only 5% of them detransitioned because they realized that transitioning wasn't for them. Overall, the people who detransitioned because they weren't happy represented 0.4% of the overall sample of those 27,000 people. As you can see here, there are a bunch of reasons why somebody would detransition. Number one is pressure from a parent. Then it goes transitions too hard for them. They face too much harassment, trouble getting a job, pressure from family members, friends, etc. And then all the way down there is that they realize that gender transition wasn't for them. This review of about 27 studies of trans people found that 1% of people regretted having gender affirming surgery. This study found that 99.7% of trans people were happy with their results after getting surgery. This study found that 98% of children who start gender affirming care continue it on into adulthood. This survey, spanning about 50 years, found that only 2% of people regretted any kind of gender-affirming care. As you can see by all these studies, the rate of regret and detransitioning amongst the transgender community is incredibly low. By comparison, around 9% of people regret getting knee replacement surgery. This survey found that 65% of people regret getting some kind of cosmetic surgery, and around 9% of people die from some kind of heart surgery. But nobody uses those statistics to argue that we should ban heart surgery, knee replacement surgery, or even cosmetic surgery. It's illogical to argue that we should ban transgender healthcare just because a tiny minority of people might regret their decision.
Okay, and then the second one. I will make this happen.
Fast fact. In July of 2022, the American Academy of Pediatrics published a study that looked at the gender identities of trans youth 5 years after they underwent a complete social transition. This included things such as changing their appearance to their preferred gender identity, changing their first name, and pronouns. The study looked at 317 children ranging from the ages of 3 to 12, male and female. Results indicated that of these children, at the end of 5 years, only 2.5% retransitioned to cisgender. 3.5% of them identified as non-binary, and 94% of the original children who identified as transgender remained transgender.
Okay, so some more food for thought, and then just to verify the sources, what I'm going to place in the chat now for you is some of these sources are available for download, and some of them are, a few of them are behind a paywall. So I've divided it according to the sources that are downloadable and what those that are behind a paywall. And then, of course, if you're struggling to capture this or copy this from the chat, please know I have it, and I'm more than happy to also email this information to you. Okay, so I'm going to now just make a few reflections, and then I'm going to hand over to Chris for some of his reflections. So as you know, I mean, I've been involved in gender affirming healthcare for basically almost 20 years now. And one of the ahas, I remember one of my early realizations, particularly when I found myself working with children and adolescents, what I noted was that often when it happened with adults as well, but with young persons in particular, when they would come out and start expressing that they were having an experience where aspects of their gender identity was not matching their gender assigned at birth, that often the aspect of their experience that seemed to cause the most intense experience of dysphoria and discomfort were often the aspects of their awakening experience of their gender identity that was furthest from their gender assigned at birth. So if I was working with a young person who was, say, male assigned at birth, and they were experiencing aspects in their subjective sense of their gender identity that was particularly leaning towards the feminine, that was the most kind of pronounced for them in their experience, and the source of their, their most significant distress and or dysphoria. And then as I would be working alongside this client, this young person with their family, and they were being seen, they were being heard, they were being acknowledged, we were working together in affirming them, and they got to the place of realizing this is no longer being resisted. They now are being given the safe space to be themselves. What was interesting, what I noted for some of my young clients who often later identified, for example, as gender non-binary, were that as they were reaching towards, let's say, for example, the feminine, and they were being allowed to express that, and they were able to explore it and experience it, and it was now no longer this aspect that was felt deep within themselves, but needed to be hidden, that once they were allowed to express and embrace that aspect of themselves, it was almost like a widening of their awareness of themselves, and this kind of realizing, but there's more here. There's more to me when it comes to my gender, and what may then, feel more comfortable, and what some might have, and in the problematic way that, the terms like detransition has been used, was this person going, okay, well, there's actually now aspects of masculine that's not that uncomfortable for me, and may actually be something, now that I've been able to do the work that I've needed to do, I'm able to look at and experience and embrace. And that's where I very powerfully started seeing and coming to an appreciation again of what Alexandre talks about, the fluidity model, was this understanding of how much more complex and nuanced. And I love the recent use of the concept of galaxy, when a galaxy, that, this four-dimensional aspect of who we are as human beings is being embraced as a descriptor. But seeing these young persons realize, but I am more complex, I am more nuanced. On a number of the research I've been doing, for example, around non-binary young persons, and I listen to their narratives and their stories shared often on social media platforms. That's often the message, or what I hear them talking about, this journey, this process, this exploration that they've been on, and that often where they started and they thought they were going to need to be going towards, and as they're on that journey, coming to this newer insights, but they're only able to come to that because they've been given, the space and the affirmation and the acceptance to say, tell us who you are, and you're probably still figuring out aspects of who you are. And then I started seeing, this diversity, this fluidity. And yes, I definitely obviously did work with clients where their gender identity was very clear within what people will say the binary, and that never wavered for them. And then there have been more and more, and interestingly for me, in my experience, it has been in particular working with younger people, this opening up of the diversity. Specifically, another reflection, I have personally not yet worked with a client who has detransitioned, in the sense of that their experience has been that the journey they went on, they came to the discovery is not who they are and where they need to go, and they return to the gender they were assigned at birth. So I can't speak to that because I haven't had that experience. But I've had clients, two clients come to mind, particularly who detransitioned but did not detransition. And I'm presently working with a client who's considering a detransition. And in all three of these cases, the first two, it was because they entered a new relationship. And the person they were in a relationship with initially was accepting of them. And then as the relationship became more established, their partners started making certain demands. And I remember particularly for these two clients, how part of their own anxiety and fear was this fear that they were going to grow old alone, and who's going to love me, who's going to want me as a trans person. And I saw the first two clients in particular detransition for the sake of the relationship, and they essentially were sacrificing their true selves in service of trying to sustain and maintain and kind of hold on to that relationship. And for both of those clients, within a year or two, those relationships failed, and they took up and realized that the sacrifice that they had made was firstly was not what they should have done for themselves. They didn't act in their own best interest. And I recently have a client where she is really struggling with being alone and finding a partner. And for her, the consideration of possibly detransitioning is not because her experience is that I'm not a woman. Her experience is maybe, I might find someone because who I am as a trans person seems to be a particular challenge when it comes to meeting potential partners for life. So those are just some of my initial thoughts. I'm going to hand over to Chris for some of your reflections. Chris, and then we'll have a conversation and engage the audience.
Thanks, Ron, and thanks, Ron, for finding this wonderful TikToks and also the video that we watched. So when we started talking about it last year in Path, they said that we should start talking about transitioning and retransitioning and detransitioning. I think there was already a kind of a conversation, should this be something we need to talk about? And the moment you start saying, should this be something we need to talk about, the question becomes, why are we wondering about it? Why are we even wondering, should we? And then we put it on our list for this year, and Ron and I said, no, we'll tackle this. And again, it kind of crept up on us to share with you tonight our thoughts. And as we started planning for this, there was for me this one sense of sharing and talking about it. How much am I going to get into trouble? Because as Ron mentioned, we have these two sides that we're dealing with. It is on the one side, this group that's saying it doesn't exist, that kind of denial. And then on the other side, we have this group that says, oh, well, we have a detransitioner, let's throw them also on TikTok and create a lot of problems for our trans community. But I think, again, it is this kind of binary aspects that we start seeing. And if we say, okay, right, all alt-right is going to use all of that, we know not everybody is completely there. And if we say all people that are more activists are going to deny it, it's again the extremes. And then we come in, and then we in the end land up more in the middle. And I wonder where we're going to place ourselves as healthcare providers, as psychologists, as social workers. Where are we placing ourselves on this continuum? Because on the one side, it creates that question and that ethical dilemma. If I was there for this person in their transitioning story, their exploration, their movement in their own transitioning, being it social transitioning and maybe even related to a medical transition, and the person comes to me and saying, I got it all wrong. What do I do? But I think as I read and prepared, and as I've also traveled through my own studies and research through these aspects, I started realizing that the regret factor is a very small group. And as you also heard on the TikToks, it's what, 0.4% in the one study. I mean, it can move a bit around. So on the one side, it doesn't seem to be necessarily regret. And then I'm also wondering, how do we structure it? And how do we, in the end, position it that it becomes regret? Because we know that not anything in life is only good or bad. And not anything is only fantastic. So quite often transitioning is seen as this becoming, but becoming also doesn't mean everything is well. We talk about euphoria as again the counter of dysphoria, because we love to have binaries, but in the end, we're not just euphoric when we transition. We also sometimes dysphoric while we transition. And we can also be on the other side, the so-called other side for the binary now, and say, but I still struggle with dysphoria and I have euphoria, and there's in between. Things that I have to say goodbye to and things that I can embrace. And I think that is quite often what we see with our clients. Now, I know this year it's been quite a hectic year for a lot of people, especially for trans people in our Pride Month. And I've seen a lot of clients coming back with a reflection on how difficult it's been and how difficult it is to be trans. And the kind of words of, I wouldn't have chosen to be this. I have to accept, embrace that I am this. And again, that is, again, a binary that we construct there of, we choose it or we don't choose this, we made this way, we're not made this way. It's always kind of as we want to find aspects that embodies and gives us a kind of a certainty what we are doing is right or is good or is what we want to do. Now, when I spoke to Ron the other day, I said to him, I so struggle to find clients that I've seen that has detransitioned. I have some clients that has played around in gender and maybe has been trans man and then trans masculine and then non-binary and that fluidity that they embrace. But this kind of regret and moving back, that I haven't seen yet. But it doesn't mean it's not there, because there is such a diverse way of experience who we are and becoming and finding out. And for a person that moves that way and then back this way doesn't mean it's wrong. It is their experience. And how then, as healthcare providers, do we provide a safe space for a person to be themselves? I've witnessed a client that came to me that has detransitioned due to not having funds for hormones. And I've seen the horror of it and how it was for the person even worse not to be themselves, because there was a time that they were themselves, and said they feel more suicidal because they see all these features coming back, and the features that they embrace through the hormones, they are moving away, and dealing with that and going back on hormones and the euphoria of that I've seen. I've seen young people that socially transitioned and embraced the idea of being trans masculine and using the pronoun he, and then realizing that that is not where they are. But because it was within the social transitioning space, for them to still move around was much easier. And then I've seen one client that was on hormones and decided not to be on hormones because they were happy where they were and they felt they don't want to continue with hormones. And as I was trying to kind of find myself through all these readings and all these thoughts and preparation for tonight, I thought, is that then a retransitioner, or is that a retransitioner that's transitioning in any case still, or if it's still part of the same transitioning that it kind of never stopped? And I think that is the thoughts that has come to me in my preparation. And it reminds me that when I came into the world of being trans, into the world of the trans communities, because I don't think we're only one community. I think there's various trans communities. And started exploring there. It was quite this trans binary idea. You are moving from this side to that side. So you're definitely a trans man or a trans woman. And gender non-conforming was not heard about. And if you think you're somewhere in between, there's something wrong. So that was the beginning of the trans world in South Africa. And then we started embracing gender non-conforming people. And then it started becoming, okay, we can have gender diverse people. And now we see the word non-binary and more people identifying with that. And I think it's also how we explore gender and the world of gender as we see more and more possibilities and fluidities. And we are starting to say, but is this a construction? If it's a construction, how are we constructing it now? And then for us being a bit older versus younger, and we've heard how long Ron has been already in the field, so obviously he is the grandparent of all of us, very, very old. As we see the young people coming in, we see that they play much more with fluidity and they explore much more gender. So when I see now 10, 11, 12-year-olds walking into my practice room, it is this gender play, this gender thought, this movement. And we maybe have been more in this kind of very structured ideas and still ticking the boxes. So my question in the end of the day, and I would like to also hear a bit from Ron's side on that, is us that are affirming therapists, we that affirm trans people for who they are, how much are we indirectly also playing into the marginalization of people that detransition or retransition? And how much are we upholding this trans narrative? And what can we then do as affirming therapists to also affirm our clients that says, well, this is part of my journey. I've now moved this way, and now I'm moving back this way, or I'm moving now into another direction. And how can we make sure that we don't marginalize our trans community, that hopefully will get to a point that we also can embrace our detransitionists? So over to you, Ron.
Thanks, Claire.
And then we can chat about that.
Absolutely. So yeah, so before I get to that point, just one of the other reflections that I came, something we always something we talk about often in our arena of gender affirming healthcare and also within, being transgender, is the power of language, the power of terminology, the fact that our language is evolving all the time, and we are developing new terminologies that better capture and express people's unique nuances in their experiences and their identities. And one of the other ahas that happened for me when I was also engaging with this material was seeing how the language has also evolved. Because I remember in the beginning, the only term you ever heard was detransition. And it was, every time the word was said, it was like dropping an atomic bomb into a space, because you either had kind of the more activist voices screaming and shouting and trying to quieten and almost demonizing the persons, and on the other side you had the people using them, as I mentioned earlier, as the bogeyman to fuel their anti-gender affirming healthcare positions. So you only heard detransition, and just in the in the literature that we looked at for tonight, and there's more, we didn't cover everything, it's impossible. But I think so you have detransition and then retransition, interrupted transition, desistance, discontinued transition. And for me, it's almost, as I look at those words, it almost represents for me the kind of almost like is these touchstone moments in the journey of us trying to figure this out. And as you know, we came to realize more and more about how complex this is, how much more nuanced it is, we were trying to find the words. So those words almost like track for me a reflection of how we as gender affirming healthcare practitioners, but also the transgender community and gender diverse community more broadly, have tried to grapple with this. So that was just the one thing, the one point that I wanted to highlight there. And yes, and the more I thought about, you know, the persons and those who do detransition, yes, we do know they're a small number, but there are still people who matter. And I found myself kind of my empathy and my heart kind of really constricted is, where do they go to? Who do they turn to? On the one side, they're being used. On the other side, they're being yelled at. Where is the safe space? Where is the place? And that's where we have to step up as the gender affirming healthcare practitioners. And that means we need to include our understanding that for some, the gender exploration journey may be that where they thought they needed to go and what they come to realize means a return to where they, you know, a return to what they were assigned at birth. And that is not a failure. That is not a something was wrong. That was the journey that individual needed to go through. And we need to be the community that they can turn to. And that's the part that kind of, the more and more I thought about this, kind of really, I struggled with that, because who else can they go to? They're definitely, in my assumption, not going to be understood by healthcare practitioners outside of the knowledge and understanding that we would have as gender affirming healthcare practitioners. So I think it's definitely, if I may even reach into ethics, I think it's our ethical responsibility as gender affirming healthcare practitioners in particular to embrace this, try and work towards understanding it, educate ourselves, inform ourselves, because we also need to be the place where these people or the persons with this experience can come to and also receive affirmation, acknowledgement, care for their experience. I don't know if I answered your question in the end, because I went on a ramble there.
I just love your rambles. So I don't know what the answer was in any case that you had to give, Ron, but I think you definitely contributed to the thoughts around this, because I also think quite often when I see parents, they would say, oh, but you know, how many regret it? And I reflected on that, of how often we'd say, oh, no, don't worry, it's only 1% or 2% or 0.5%, or whichever one we want to then embrace at that point. But my question is nearly if we don't then also add to it being wrong. Instead of starting to talk about this absolutely wonderful fluidity of the gender journey, and that it is not a fixed end and a beginning and here we go, but that it's much more a becoming, and that we can't really predict. We can maybe say, okay, we know most people will go there, but there's nothing wrong if a person also moves to more ideas, because I do think by having this kind of construction of, oh, you know, it's so few, that we, in a certain sense, build on a construction where people can't explore and can't be, and can't think more about their identity because they have to arrive somewhere. And I think that is very sad about a gender construction that is so rigid in any case, that we have to be this or that or cisgender, and we can't think even more what it means to be cisgender and what it means, all the different nuances in being, let's say, cisgender, because this is how cisgender should be, instead of this is what it is for me. And not even cisgender, but what is gender for me, what it is to be myself, that we can even take ourselves out of the gender category.
No, absolutely. And as you were describing that, almost when the way you were illustrating that, it feels like the original way that, detransition kind of came onto the arena, and these two polar opposites that we described earlier, and then how it initially played out. The thought that I hadn't thought of it in this way until now, is almost like a trauma. It's a trauma. It's an injury that happened, to the trans and gender diverse community, in that it was misunderstood and construed in the way, and it obviously it needed to take the time for it to be deconstructed to where we are now, where we do understand, that it's so much more nuanced. But absolutely, that what injury has that instilled in the kind of the collective psyche of how we think and feel, and and even maybe then as healthcare practitioners navigate our, as you were saying, even kind of reassuring a parent by saying, well, only 1%, what are we also kind of communicating in articulating that? And that definitely needs more reflection and appreciation and understanding. It feels like we've wagged our lips quite a lot. So Chris, I'll hand over to you, and I'll be interested to hear some thoughts and comments from our audience. Did you want to make another? Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I just want to end also just with this idea of the performativity of transnormativity. We have become so performative, and I think it's a lot to do also with the gatekeeping model that we brought in a way, that you have to perform a certain way that you can be good enough to transition. And the question is, how much is that normativity, again now, the transnormativity, starting to play itself out? And how can we help, first of all, ourselves to get out of that trauma position, out of that reacting position, and saying, oh, why am I scared that I made this mistake, with a person saying, no, but I'm now journeying this way. Why do I have that fears? And then secondly, what are we bringing over to our community? But yes, I agree with you. Now you
captured. I was saying Alexandra articulated that quite well in his presentation in that last part, where he unpacks cisnormativity, transnormativity, and the importance of that, that thinking that has influenced so much. So yes, audience, you've been listening to us hunting on like two debaters. Some thoughts, some comments. Happy to take some.
And please do speak, otherwise you will never have a chance with the two of us continuing.
Alexa, I see your hand.
Yeah, this is such an interesting conversation, because I was kind of preparing for that question of, what about parents who obviously have immediately gone and looked at all these detransitioning videos and gotten themselves so freaked out. And it's something so important to reflect on, as you say, is that you also don't want to just make it seem as though, well, it's not a reality that someone might detransition, and to not stigmatize that too as part of the journey. But I guess one of the difficulties is that it almost feels sometimes like parents or others are looking to you to guarantee that if you're going to sort of encourage the gender affirming transitioning process, especially if the teenager is wanting to medically transition, how can you get their support if you then don't motivate for why you think, no, this is what this child wants? Because of course no one can guarantee what someone is going to want in the future. Teenager, it is just the start of figuring out their identities. And I find there is this pull online for where people fall down these rabbit holes of fear mongering around all these disastrous stories of people regretting, and then they kind of turn to that, well, how can you justify encouraging a teenager to transition when you don't know if they're going to regret it later on? And it's a complicated conversation.
Absolutely. And what I'm taking from that as well is, and why it really is important that as healthcare providers, that we need to inform ourselves with this knowledge and with all the research, so that because you can easily fall into the trap of then wanting to give that parent those reassurances to ensure that the young person is going to get what they need, but that's actually ethically not appropriate. But if we're not going to inform ourselves and engage with this understanding, we're not going to develop the language and the way of then addressing a parent and say, I cannot give you a guarantee, but this is what I can, I can tell you about the possibilities and the options here. And it is challenging to then be true, be authentic, be honest, while at the same time, also being supportive. And it becomes more complicated. Chris, if you have...
and how do we take that idea of wrong and mistake out of that 1%? And how do we say that this is part of the journey? It is okay if they are one of the 1%, and then we work with that. And it is very complex, because I do think quite often when I work with families and with young people is also the whole idea of the risk aspect of not transitioning, and how do we deal with this, and how do we journey with the family. And I think that is why it is always this thing of each person is so individual and so individualized, because you can get a parent, and I have had them, that says, no, my kid really, they have been saying now for 2 years they want testosterone, we must get going with it. And they haven't really explored identity yet. But because the parent is one of these people that just wants to provide and get things right, and here we go, versus the parent that says, I don't know, I can't think about this. So I think it is a whole system that we're dealing with. We know that to have parents on board is very important in any position, in any case, in any therapy. So much more when we work in the transitioning field. And I don't think there is an easy answer. And I think we need to, on an ethical way of being, also be able to explore the risks that's there. And the facts that, yes, there can be this kind of changes, and there might be a possibility. And how do we hold all of that? Because it is not one or the other.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. Kevin, I see your hand. You want to jump in?
Let's see if that works. Oh, okay, good. So, firstly, it's nice to just say, now I know why I respect you guys so much. You think about things. It's great. And there are a couple of things that I just wanted to highlight. Firstly, a shout out to Alma, because this is one of her things, which is humankind, be both. And yeah, essentially that's what it boils down to. And secondly, to share how many times surgery has humbled me in the last 30 odd years. And one of the ways that I've coped with it is in realizing that there are certain things which are not my responsibility. It's easy to beat yourself up because we get arrogant as professionals, thinking we know it all. I am the expert. And it's also about realizing, yes, you are, speaking for myself, I am a pretty good surgeon, and that's what I'm good at. I can do operations. But it's not my responsibility to take on other people's life choices. And that in many ways has helped me to sleep better at night. And I like what you were saying, Ron, about this kind of crisis of conscience when you get somebody who detransitions. And my current approach, and I think you guys will recognize it, it's evolved immensely over the years, is to say, yes, I'm pretty good at doing operations, but the rest of it I'm no good at. So in a lot of ways, I'm kind of wanting to say for the mental health professionals, that is your speciality. And for all of you, I recognize how good you are at it, but it doesn't mean that you're not good just because somebody else makes different life choices. And yeah, I've been thinking about this since I saw the topic published. And again, I've recently had a client who has vocalized the need to detransition, and I'm taking a fair bit of flack from the parents. And I'm kind of sitting here this evening going, well, actually, I did my job, and yes, there are things that we need to explore as to why there was this, sudden, well, prior to the surgery and everything else, it seemed very binary in a way, in that I am transitioning. And now, almost out of the blue, it's I want to detransition. And for that human being, I think that there are life events that have altered circumstances. And I like what everybody's been saying is at the end of the day, I think we just need to be supportive and try and be friendly to another human being, which is kind of what we're supposed to be about. And I've lost my other points, so I'll shut up now.
And also, the point that you're making there, that everyone's experience is legitimate, and that detransition, a young person you're referring to, their experience is legitimate. What is reassuring is the amount of research that's come out on that 2015 survey in particular, that looked at all of the various factors that have contributed to persons making the decision to alter aspects of their transition journeys, is helping us understand that it is so much more complex. And that is then, as multidisciplinary team members, that when you have a client, say that to you, Kevin, that you hopefully know, well, I can confidently say to my client, I've got the people that you can go and sit with, and you're going to work this through, and they'll work it out with you. And then as your surgeon, with their support and guidance, we'll figure this out. This is not a disaster. This is not something went wrong. Something has shifted and changed, and it needs to be understood, and that's okay. And not go into the crisis kind of mode that is often the kind of energy that hangs around these types of conversations. Thanks, Kevin. Ariana, sorry, I was waxing again. Jump in.
I was enjoying the waxing, just like everyone else. Thank you. I know exactly who Kevin's talking about. I think my anxiety as the endocrinologist, and it's probably worse for Kevin, is we actually physically do something that can't be undone. But I have to say, the patients I've had who've, don't know which word to use now, I think most of them have just got to a point where they're happy with what's happened and they want to stop. And I had that anyway. Yeah, okay, thank you. So the first time I had that, I thought, well, that it was well thought out, total support from the family. And we've had a few. They get to the point where this is enough now. I don't dislike what the testosterone's done, but I don't want any more. Thank you very much, and we can stop. And I must say, my anxiety has been, okay, so you don't need me anymore because I prescribe the hormones. But what am I going to do to make sure you're still okay? So most of the families I've had have had, parents who are still working with that person. The other ones I've had are the ones who just don't come to clinic anymore. And I think those are probably social pressures, poverty, as you guys have mentioned. And then, so I think one of my other anxieties about the patient Kevin and I are talking about is this young person, their thing is completely legitimate, but they have focused on getting information about the physical aspects of the change and are flatly refusing to talk to anyone, as far as I can tell. And what advice would you guys give me? I mean, must I see this person and have a long discussion about what I'm going to do about the hormones this way around, which I'm happy to do, but I feel like maybe some more, you see, now I don't want to gatekeep either. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I'm just thinking focusing on the physical aspects is maybe okay, but not the best way to go. I'm not sure. Thanks.
I just have this general principle in so much of my practice, Ariana, as I always, when you don't know, you don't know, and not knowing is a place. So that's something, that's a mantra I always say to myself, so that I don't fall into that anxiety if I'm supposed to know and I'm supposed to have the answer. But I'm very much also an intuitively driven practitioner. So if something is not sitting comfortable with me, and I know this is not about gatekeeping, and informed consent, as we know, is an important principle here as well. And if my sense is that to help us move forward, some exploration is needed, some conversation is needed, I'm definitely going to suggest that and recommend that, and try and help the client understand why that may be helpful. Absolutely. I don't know, Chris, you got some thoughts there?
I think it is very difficult, and I think it is for many of us the one thing that will really trigger our fear, because we want the best for our clients. And again, this whole feeling of it's a mistake, and again, that construction, how we construct the idea. And I do wonder if there could have been a conversation, and Ariana, I don't say you must have this conversation, but if there was this conversation with this family of seeing it as part of a process and a part of becoming, and not, oh, we are now returning. I mean, they can't return. There's no way. And I'm not talking only physically, I mean, emotionally, this is where you've been, this is your life experiences, this is maybe what was needed as part of your journey, and most likely because you've gone through and down that road, but that it is part of a becoming, and that it enriches the person versus, oh, now this has been taken away. And then again, I think it's how we construct it. And the more we're going to have this fear of people changing, which we all should be doing as we grow as people, and the more we're going to have this kind of, oh my word, I have done something wrong, or I could do something wrong, the more we're going to step into this fear. But I also do understand why it is there, and I think all of us, it is very strongly from that position of we want the best, and now there's been a physical change. But the question could in the end be, how do we embrace that? And what is then causing dysphoria, and how do we work with that? So I think there's a lot of exploration needed, really, to understand the situation as well. But because so often we just want to tick a box and get it over and done with and find the answer as a parent and just get our kid okay again. We can't look at the complexities and all the nuances that's here. And it might have been wonderful for the family as such to start opening up all the different nuances that's there.
Thanks, Chris. Sure, well, we've had quite a robust conversation, a lot of content covered. We're nearly at the end of our time. Are there any last thoughts, comments, reflections?
Or even anybody, or even if somebody wants to add to these thoughts around this case.
Ariana,
any thoughts around that?
No, just I had meant to say that listening to this evening has been like my whole gender affirming healthcare life in front of me. Like Ron was saying, the words we've had to use. Yeah. And Michelle and I are going, we totally understand the boys and the girls, but the slot that are in the middle, and now we have to learn to understand them because that's life. So what Michelle and I have started actively doing is, are you still happy with what we are doing? You are not, because sometimes, they come to endocrine clinic, and I was reading that Tavistock book, and I think some families feel railroaded. You've seen me once, you've sent me off, now I'm on the hormones. Please take me off this train. And we're now learning to say, it's okay to say you want to get off. Do you want to stop? Are you happy with carrying on? which
Yeah.
is a worthwhile conversation for us anyway in the endocrine clinic.
Absolutely.
Indeed.
And in the best interest of the young person that's on that journey. Yeah.
Mm.
Often, especially with young people, if we don't ask those questions, it's almost like they need the permissions, because sometimes young people, and I find particularly in the South African context, we are very much disciplinarian families. And I find that across our cultures, you know, you respect the elders, you don't question, you don't challenge, you don't ask. So if we, especially as the gender affirming healthcare providers, aren't going to let young people know you actually can change your mind, or you can question. And by you asking it, you give the permission. And I do think that's an important tool, the way that we work or need to work, especially in this field.
And the whole idea that informed consent is ongoing. It is not once off. It's not now, it's done. It is a thing that is continuous, because people do grow and evolve.
And Dr. Chelly, you had a hand. You want to jump in, and then we'll be tying things up soon.
I'll keep it short and sweet since it's late. I've had a lot of thoughts this evening spanning, I think, the vastness of the gender galaxy. But the one thing that has stood out for me, something that Elliot Kotzer has said to me once, and I'll always remember, and it's when someone tells you who they are, believe them. And so, sure, that's within the realm of basically all adolescents have personality disorders until proven otherwise, but it's not their fault. You know, the frontal lobes haven't myelinated, etc., etc. But let's not even be so mean to them. Humans in general are humans, gender diverse, transhumans also within there. And so people do change and grow and learn. And you don't know what you don't know, which was really nicely highlighted in terms of, I don't know how much femininity I need to lean into or want to lean into or identify with until I'm given any room to sort of dance and tango with it and then decide how much more I want. I think that a lot of our concerns come from me as practitioner, because of the space being so often, if not always, just politically and emotionally charged. I think a child or adolescent or person having the space to share with family any kinds of thoughts, rethinking of their gender, or being a bit non-binary, or wanting to stop or discontinue transition. Inherently for me, I'm almost thinking there must be some kind of safe space there to be able to share that. Because firstly, it was difficult to come out. Now you're like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna get this. So in a way, for parents, it's part of the process. For me as the primary healthcare provider, it's part of the process to delve. And I'd look at this person the same way as when they first came in saying, I'm gender non-binary, or I'm trans male, I'm trans female. It's like, okay, cool, let's unpack. Would be the exact same thing. Okay, cool, let's unpack. And then we see where we go from there. Because it's not my job to have an opinion. It's my job to use hopefully available guidelines, leave my personal opinion at the door. In private, we like, oh, don't get sued, but don't change your medical management because of that. But yeah, looking at that person the same way you did the first time and believing them when they tell you who they are. And support for parents always is.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nicole. Much appreciated. And on the mark, wisdoms all round.